Hello and welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi, and today we're doing a debate review of the recent Inspiring Philosophy versus Cosmic Skeptic debate on the problem of evil. And the title of that debate was, Would God Allow Evil? And so today with me, I have Jon McCray. What do you meme? He's here. Inspiring Philosophy is here. And then Justin Mooney. You may not be familiar with Justin. You're probably familiar if you're watching this and are interested in this type of thing. You're probably familiar with Jon. You're probably familiar with Michael because he was in the debate. And well, Justin is a philosopher. He's actually in the process of getting his PhD. Is that correct?
Yep.
That's correct. And he's a philosopher. And I actually had him on the show previously talking about a different type of response to the problem of evil. And, okay, I guess Jon's just going to leave us.
John.
No,
John?
I'm sure he'll be back.
But,
Justin
also helped me. He also helped write my opening statement and prepare for the debate.
Yeah, that's what I was going to add too. So Justin is a really cool guy, really, really smart. And he's just one of the things that I like about him, if I can just dote on him for a second, is I just really like how he explains things. So I'm really excited to do this review today. So basically what we have planned for today is to do we have 4 clips queued up. So the first first 3 clips are actually taken from Alex's opening, and we're going to talk about these 3 clips in detail. And then the 4th clip is taken from his second rebuttal where he talks about animal suffering. And so I think each clip is around 2 minutes long. So when we queue these up, we'll just play them out and then we'll provide some commentary and our thoughts on it afterwards. But before we play any clips, should we say just some general thoughts about the debate? Actually, Michael, let me ask you, how did you think the debate went? How did you think that you did?
I thought I did pretty good, honestly. I think my first rebuttal was underwhelming. I was trying to articulate some things, but I thought I was able to bring it more together in the second rebuttal. So I was happy with how the debate turned out. I will definitely refer people to the debate if they want to see a conversation on the problem of evil, because I thought it turned out well. I thought Alex brought up some good points as well. I'm still kind of confused on what his main points he was trying to articulate across were. I think maybe he didn't really get them out as well as he could have, so maybe if he does a follow-up he can clarify some things or whatnot. But yeah, overall I was happy.
Yeah, and also I think Justin might actually be able to help all of us kind of get some clarity, and because he's just good at conceptualizing. And yeah, so I think that through the process of this review today, it's actually going to be really helpful for I think all of us. But let me turn it over to Jon. What did you think about the debate, Jon?
Yeah, so to be straight up, I didn't watch all of it, but I watched a good amount of it, kinda. And I was doing it, but I thought it was interesting too, and I thought Alex brought up some interesting points, and so did IP too, some different kind of interesting points. So I'm kind of looking forward to like fleshing out a little of it and then seeing what IP says about some of it. So
yeah, Justin, tell me about your thought. I'll share some of my thoughts in a bit, but then Justin, what were your overall thoughts? You watched the whole thing, right? Even the Q&A?
Yep. Is my audio working now, by the way?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting debate. There were a lot of familiar points that were raised, a few new points that were raised, and I think kind of as the discussion went on, it became really clear where the fundamental disagreements were, and that's very useful for thinking about, issues, to see where the disagreements actually are, where they're stemming from. I also thought that both Michael and Alex did just a really phenomenal job of modeling like respectful, constructive discussion. I think that YouTube discussions should aspire to be like theirs in that respect.
Amen. Yeah, well, I'll share a little about my thoughts of the debate, because doing a formal debate, this is one of the first ones that we've done. And so normally what we do is just have an open dialogue about something. And I posted a comment on that video saying that I liked this format for at least one reason, is that instead of like when you do a discussion, when it's just open dialogue, sometimes, and I'm thinking of a particular discussion that I have in mind where this happened, where sometimes what can happen in an open dialogue is like you focus on one point and that's all that's discussed like the whole time, is like some random tangential point, and that's not necessarily bad. But with a debate like this, with a formal debate, both speakers have a whole lot more time to kind of flesh out their whole response instead of being stopped. And sometimes when you ask for clarity, that's a good thing when you can get clear on like what someone is saying, but that can completely throw them off their train of thought and they won't be able to get out what else they had to say. And so I think there's positives and negatives to each one. But I thought that this one was interesting. It was really good to be able to hear their views fleshed out a little bit more, and I'm kind of drawn toward wanting to do these more often, more of these types of formal debates. So those are some of my initial thoughts on format. But one of the things that I was really impressed by was Alex's opening statement. I thought that his opening statement was very interesting. It raised a couple really interesting philosophical problems that one of them in particular I've already thought about and produced a video on, but the other two allowed me to do a little bit more philosophical introspection and think about it more. So it was really cool. And we're about to play some of these clips and get into some of the meat here. But those were my overall thoughts. I think that Alex's opening was very, very good. And so if we were just going by openings, I think that Alex may have won that part. But then when we did the first rebuttal, second rebuttals, and through the Q&A, I think that Michael had a leg up there. But if we're wanting to ask the question, who did we think won, which some people might find important, some people won't find that important, but that's kind of where I landed. So feel free to share any thoughts on that.
As I've said on JMD Apologetics channel numerous times, I don't even really like using those terms because we're not scoring points. How do you win a debate, honestly? I mean, everyone who was on Alex's side is probably going to say he won, and everyone who's on my side and I've gotten numerous messages saying I won the debate. But, it tends to be usually what happens. And I tend to try to, what I strive to do, and I fail at this too, but I strive to say, I think X, person did really good at this part, or the other person did really good at that part, kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think that to piggyback off of what Justin said earlier, is that one of the reasons why I like to invite Alex on so often, he's been on my channel a bunch, is, well, first of all, he's popular. That's a good thing, but that's not the only reason why I want to have him on. The main reason why I want to have him on is because he exemplifies these virtues of, really seems like he's seeking the truth, and it really seems like he takes philosophy seriously, thinking seriously, critical thinking seriously. He's even in the process right now, as I've been watching him, he's in the process right now of like looking at some of the things he said just a couple years ago and be like, yeah, I was wrong about that. And that's just something that we don't see very often, I don't think, on YouTube. And it needs to be praised. And so, Alex, if you're watching this, which you probably are, kudos on what you're doing. I like it a lot. All right, well, shall we play a clip? Okay, cool, getting nods. So we're going to do the first clip, which is about 2 minutes long, and this one is the free will, or the heaven objection to free will defense. So we'll play the whole clip, and then we'll provide some response to it. I'm going to cue it up here. Here we go.
Is there free will in heaven? Heaven is a place devoid of suffering, where nobody's killing anyone, no one's torturing anyone, no holocausts or wars are taking place. Yet presumably, unless heaven is the kind of robotic, compelled nature condemned by Michael, there must also be free will. If this is the case, then here we have an example of humans existing with free will, and yet there being no evil. Michael may wish to respond to this by saying that those in heaven still have a capacity for evil, but the very reason they're in heaven is because they're the kind of person who refuses to act upon it. But in order to hold this view, some things must be assumed. Firstly, that it's possible that evil can exist in heaven and can be committed in heaven. That is, though in practice nobody commits it, there's nothing logically preventing a holocaust from taking place in heaven. Now, you may just bite the bullet on this point and say, yeah, it's no problem because it's not going to happen in practice. But this is difficult for me to believe, that there's nothing logically preventing a Nazi Holocaust reoccurring in heaven. A possible escape to this might be to suggest that the people in heaven are so good, and the reason they're in heaven is because they're so good, that it's psychologically impossible for them, essentially, to commit evil. But there are two problems with this. First, if it's really impossible for them to commit evil, then on Michael's own account, it's also impossible for them to be good, since to be good requires the capacity to be evil. If this is denied and it's asserted that it can be psychologically impossible for some people to commit evil and yet them still being a free being in the relevant sense, then what we have essentially is proof. We have proof that God is capable of producing humans who somehow have free will and yet are still incapable of committing evil, even if just as a matter of psychological impossibility. If that can obtain logically in heaven, it can obtain logically on earth too. If the reason being given for the necessity of evil is that human free will requires it, but God is capable of producing human beings with free will who are yet incapable of committing evil, the free will defense collapses.
All right, so the basic point here is that this is a response to the free will theodicy. He says the free will defense, and I'm not sure if he's actually referencing the philosophical free will defense that Alvin Planning has given in his work. I'm unsure about that, but either way, I think he's addressing the free will defense that comes up so often in these discussions about the problem of evil. Is we talk about free will and the value of free will and how free will in some sense entails a world of suffering. And what Alex's point is that, well, what about heaven? Is there free will in heaven? Because if there is free will in heaven and people can't do what's wrong, then it seems like that's not really a response to the problem of evil, because that could have obtained on earth as well. We had free will, and yet there was no suffering. And I hope that was a relatively okay summarization. What do you think, Justin? Was there any more to that objection or that argument that he gave that I missed?
No, that sounds like a good summary to me. Roughly the problem is, hey, look, there's reason to think that you could be both free and unable to do evil in heaven. And if that's true, then why couldn't God have just made us that way initially?
Yeah, do you remember how you responded to that initially, Michael?
Yeah, my basic point was basically at the idea that, yeah, there is free will in heaven. I mean, there was a war in heaven, and last time that happened, it produced immense suffering. There were the angels rebelling and all that stuff. So my basic point is that, well, of course there's free will in heaven. Of course there's the possibility for suffering. The difference is that the reason why there's not the immense suffering that there is on earth in heaven is for the same reason that no adults are putting quarters in their mouths, even though we may have done it when we were 2. So we have matured to the point where we know that stuff would be horrible for us. A good analogy might be comparing, when he brings up the idea that, well, God could just create free creatures in heaven. Well, that's not really the same. I mean, think about raising your child to learn things on their own, struggling, doing bad things, learning from the mistakes. That seems like a far more mature adult compared to building a robotic person in the movie or in the HBO show Westworld. They think they're free, but really they're just programmed by the guest to act a certain way. And so we can clearly see that there's a huge difference between a child sort of slowly maturing and using their free will properly versus, God just sort of programming us like we were in Westworld to act a certain way.
What do you think, Justin?
Yeah, so I think actually the response Michael was just suggesting there, it could be interpreted a couple of different ways, but one direction you could take that is in the direction of a response that's really common in the academic literature. And this response I'm thinking of appeals to a certain view of free will that's called source incompatibilism. And roughly what this view claims is that a person's actions are free only if they are, in some sense, the ultimate causal source of those actions. But that can happen in more than one way. It could be because the action just isn't causally determined at all, or it could be because the action is causally determined by their psychology, and their psychology was made that way by their prior actions, which were not causally determined. And so the way that a lot of people apply this to the problem of heavenly freedom is this. They say, hey, look, the people who are in heaven have developed their psychologies in such a way that now their psychologies actually causally determine that they will not do evil. But they can still count as freely refraining from doing evil precisely because they were the ones who formed their psychologies that way through a series of actions, presumably like a lifetime of actions, which were not themselves causally determined. If that's how freedom in heaven works, then it's not the case that just because somebody can have their actions psychologically determined and yet free in heaven, that therefore they could have been made that way by God from the beginning. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Honestly, I'm a little distracted by the hippo behind you. What's going on with that?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is a cardboard cutout of a hippo that my brother got me for Christmas a couple of years ago. and I've just been
People are
setting
mentioning it in the comments too.
Yeah. It blocks the view of like my unmade bed and everything because I'm just in a little studio apartment here.
Yeah, no. What, you have a name for him?
Yeah, well, I didn't name him. My mom actually named him, but his name is Homer.
Well, I wanted to give my response to this objection because I've actually done a video on this, and this was one of the parts of the opening that as I was listening to it, I was like, yeah, I've kind of thought through this, and so it's not for some people that maybe haven't thought about this on their own. Anyways, let me just give it. So I think that what he was doing is he's attacking the free will defense with this objection about heaven, and so what you could say is that, well, in addition to free will, there's other theodicies, there's other goods that can obtain in a world that has earth and heaven rather than a world that just has heaven. And that's what I created a video about this. And so the first one is the good of being able to choose to enter heaven. And so it's a very great good. Like if you were to force someone to fall in love with you, that doesn't really seem like real love, genuine love. And so giving someone the opportunity to love you and enter into a relationship with you, i.e. enter into heaven, is a great good. And you can't have that in a world with just heaven. So that's one good that happens when you have a world that has earth and heaven. Another good is what Jesus did on the cross. And in the literature, this is called supralapsarianism. Another word for it is o felix culpa. If you don't know what either of those terms mean, basically what it means is that the great good of what Jesus did on the cross is one of the greatest goods imaginable in any possible world, is what Jesus did on the cross. How he loved people that hated him so much. He loved them so much. He gave his life for them and saved them. And there's no greater good than that, basically, is what this view, this argument, this theodicy says. It's called supralapsarianism. Alvin Planting is a Christian philosopher, a super smart dude. If you haven't heard of him or read any of his books, you need to. He's a ardent defender of this view as well, supralapsarianism. It's the longest word I know. And so that's the second good. So the first good is the good of being able to choose to love God or choose to enter into heaven. The second one is supralapsarianism, what Jesus did on the cross. And the third one is some of the goods that Michael mentioned in the debate, what Alex called instrumental goods, which we'll talk about that in a moment, whether or not that's actually true. But basically these higher order goods, or and just think about it yourself. Like, what are the greatest goods out there? Like, what is the greatest good? When I watch like a movie and someone does some kind of like heroic thing, I just get this sense of like, man, that's a really good thing that guy just did. And it's difficult for me to even imagine, in some cases, like a greater good than, let me give an example, particular, and this is a finite example. It's not like a fanciful movie example. I was watching a video the other day of this father whose son was killed, I think in like by anyways, his son was killed by this other guy, okay? And he was in court and he looks at his son's killer and he like just forgives him on the spot, pulls him in for a hug. And so this is an example of radical forgiveness. And when I think about goods like that, it's difficult for me to imagine a greater good, something that is better than that. And so, but notice that with something like this radical forgiveness, you can't have radical forgiveness without some type of suffering, without someone doing someone else wrong and needing to forgive that person. And so those are the basic three ways that I respond to this, is that in a world where you only have heaven, you're missing out on these other goods, some of probably the greatest goods there are. And so it makes sense that we would have a world, if God exists, that includes earth and heaven. Any thoughts, anybody?
We've not heard from John yet.
Yeah.
From John.
No. I think you guys made a lot of interesting points and good points. There's like one way that I like to kind of think about it, or at least it makes sense in my mind, is that on Earth, we have the ability to kind of choose where we want to spend eternity, right? So we can choose if we want to spend eternity with God or apart from God. And so with that comes a great good, because you have the freedom of the will to be able to choose what you want to do, to have eternity. So it could be, this isn't to say this is the conclusion, but the point I want to make here is that it could be that free will would exist for the sake of us while we're on Earth, right? And then you go to heaven and then you decide to forfeit all of, your allegiance to sin and that sort of thing. But another thing to consider is that when we so when we're talking about moral evil, we're talking about, those are sins. When we commit moral evil, we're committing sins. And the reasons why we sin usually come from things like we're trying to get some sort of unconditional love and acceptance, or we're trying to get more, money, sex, or power, one of these things. But then when we are in heaven too, like we forfeit, or we don't want those things anymore because we know that we can get them all through God, and so that's another kind of difference. But I don't think that that's all encompassing. I think that you still have to add additional arguments to make it more encompassing, but that's just kind of like the basics that come off of my mind initially.
So we had a super chat, and I'll just go ahead and read it. I can't pull it up on the screen without it like covering everyone's faces, but it's from 88 Fingers Pro. He says, "It seems to me that IP could have teased out the consequences of pleasure being equivalent to good. Good could be very different in that world where pleasure there could look like evil here."
Well, yeah, I did mention it briefly in my opening statement where I talked about how evil and suffering are not necessarily equivalent. I mean, you could have suffering and it could still be good. But I mean, I do think that is a good point. I was trying to, as I said at the opening, I feel like I could have done a little bit better in my first rebuttal. So I was trying to kind of get to that idea, is that, you could think of a world where there's just, total pleasure, and you're not going to get, you're going to get a bunch of spoiled individuals that are not going to really be mature, virtuous people. And I would say a world of suffering and virtue is far better than a world of just pleasure and no suffering. I mean, if someone came to me the day my daughter was born and said, okay, we can take her and we can put her in like some sort of capsule, and she'll be in her own little dream world, and she'll just not have to deal with any struggles, any pain, any suffering. You can visit her in there anytime you want. I'd probably say no, because I recognize that would not help her mature to become a virtuous person. Instead, she would just be this person in like 20 years that had the intelligence of a toddler, and just all she cared about was pleasure. It would just spoil her. It would not create good creatures. So you could look at a world like that and go, this could actually lead to horrible things that would ultimately not be good. It would be bad, even if that went on for eternity. Just pleasure, 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 pleasure. It doesn't seem like that would be a really good world.
What are your thoughts, Justin?
Yeah, it sounds to me like that comment is actually maybe a good segue into the concern, the argument Alex had about whether the greater goods that are often appealed to in theodicy are merely instrumentally valuable. So I don't know, maybe should we play that clip before we keep going, or
yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. Yeah, we'll play this next clip, and it's about, I don't remember how long this one is, but I think it's still around 2 minutes. So we'll play this clip, and then we'll do some more commentary.
One of the most popular I always hear is the higher goods argument. And Michael actually made this argument in his opening statement, talking about an instrumental good, like going to the gym. If you go to the gym, sure, you suffer, but it's instrumentally good because there's a higher good of health or something like that, which can be obtained by that suffering. In other words, the existence of some goods worth having necessitate the existence of some evils. For example, we can't have bravery without the existence of fear. In order for a soldier to demonstrate bravery by jumping on a grenade to save his comrades, a grenade needs to be thrown, right? If no such evils are ever committed, no such higher order goods can ever exist, and where would we be without things like bravery? But I submit the following. Bravery is only good in the first place by virtue of our need to overcome something bad. I'd rather have no fear and no need for bravery. If a soldier jumps on a grenade, we can congratulate him for his bravery, but we would be out of our minds to thank the person who threw the grenade and be grateful that it blew him up, since without that grenade, the bravery would never have manifested. And yet a Christian who uses this defense is thankful to God for throwing the grenade of suffering into the world because it allows us to develop means of overcoming that suffering, such as bravery. The logic is the same as being thankful for the existence of cancer because it allows us to develop these wonderful medical advancements like chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Without the suffering, we wouldn't have these wonderful medical advancements. But if the medical treatment is only good in virtue of it being needed to overcome cancer, we'd rather have no cancer and no chemotherapy. And if bravery is only useful or admirable insofar as it allows us to overcome fear, then we should rather have no fear and no bravery.
So Justin, I'm actually going to let you give a summary of what you think the main thrust of his argument here is, and then I have some questions for you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess I take the argument to basically just be saying, like, hey, look, there are some higher order goods or greater goods that entail that certain evils have occurred. And theists use these goods sometimes in trying to explain why God permits those evils. But Alex wants to claim these goods actually are only valuable insofar as they resist or mitigate or alleviate the evils in the world, or the suffering. I'm using evil in a broad sense to just mean bad things, which is common in the literature on the problem of evil. And it seems like the way he wants to motivate that claim is primarily through intuitions about particular cases. So, like, for example, like we wouldn't celebrate or commend, somebody who threw a grenade just because it had, good consequences in the long run or something. So I guess the argument just kind of comes down to an appeal to certain intuitions about cases, right? To try to show that actually, these values that a lot of theists appeal to are not really valuable in the way that they're supposed to be for the theodicy to work. It would be better just to have neither the higher order value and nor the evil than to have both.
Yeah, so what it sounds like to me is that he may be confusing instrumental value, and this might be the completely wrong term to use here, and correct me on this, Justin, but it's almost like when I think about something like bravery and how it entails or necessitates suffering, or the example that I gave earlier about radical forgiveness, like these cases when we think about these higher order goods, and sometimes they're referred to as like love manifesting virtues is what Trent Doherty uses in his work. When you think about these goods, they necessitate suffering, but couldn't the relationship between that good and that suffering be one of supervenience rather than this being like an example of an purely instrumental good?
Are you thinking that, like, hey, look, some of these goods might actually include evils like as parts, or as even as like essential parts, rather than just being like consequences of them? Is that what you're getting at?
No, I'm thinking that whenever you have this type of good X, you have another type of bad Y, or you have a type of suffering Y. So it's like a relation between the two, but that doesn't mean that the good is only good in virtue of having that. It's just that whenever you have X, you also have Y.
Yeah. So I mean.
So maybe the language I'm using is not the right language.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if I'm following the question. I don't know.
Maybe it'd be helpful to get clear on like what it is to be an instrumental good, because that's the language that Alex used. Is like, what is an instrumental good? Is bravery only good insofar as you need to exercise it to overcome some case of suffering or something? Right.
Yeah. So an instrumental good is something that's good for something else, roughly speaking. Right. So like, we're using Skype right now. Skype has a lot of instrumental value because it's a very useful tool. It's useful for doing other things that are good, like having dialogues about the problem of evil, for example. I don't think that Alex was confused or anything about the notion of instrumental goodness. I think the way that I interpreted him is that he was wanting to claim and to argue that in fact that's the only kind of value that something like bravery has. It is only instrumentally valuable. It's not a good thing in itself. It's just good for sort of like resisting or alleviating evil. Because if you're brave, then you can face evil and challenge it or something to that effect. That was how I was understanding.
Okay, yeah, that sounds a little bit more plausible to me too. Michael, what do you think about that claim that bravery, an example of bravery, is only good in virtue of its consequences?
I kind of agree. I mean, I agree it does have some intrinsic goodness in and of itself, but I do agree, yeah, it's more about instrumental goodness. So yeah, I do agree with that. I was actually shocked to hear Alex say that he would rather have a world with no fear and no bravery. And all I could think when he was saying that is like, that just seems to violate our basic intuitions. I mean, no one reads that book. No one watches that movie. No one raises their kids so they never have to be afraid of something. I mean, we would consider that horrible because they're spoiling and they're keeping their child from experiencing reality and maturing and growing beyond their parents. I think that such a world is actually far worse. Building on the long quote I gave from John Hick in the debate, is that type of world is just people think on the bare surface that would be better, but then when you really start to think about it, I mean, would it? I mean, think of the consequences. Think of the long-term effects on that.
I think.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no, you go ahead.
I think even like bracketing the long-term consequences. I actually think that virtues like bravery have a great deal of intrinsic and non-instrumental value. I do not think that they are merely instrumentally valuable. And one way to try to see this, so Michael, you used some, even just now, but also in the debate, you used some interesting like thought experiments that push in the direction of trying to get somebody to see the non-instrumental value of virtue and like manifestations of virtue. Here's another example of that type of thought experiment that is just doing kind of the same sort of thing that you're doing, but maybe some people will find this variation helpful. So suppose you're given a choice between two lives that you could live while on Earth. The first life is one where you are going to experience suffering at various times throughout that life, but you're also going to do some things that are morally significant. In fact, we could say that you'll even do some things at times that are morally heroic, like maybe you prevent anybody else from suffering so that you're the only one who ends up suffering in that life or something like this. And then alternatively, the second life that you could choose from is a life where there's no suffering at all. You don't suffer, nobody else suffers, but also you don't really do anything morally significant, much less morally heroic. You just kind of exist, maybe in a fairly comfortable state, maybe even a highly pleasurable state, and just don't really do anything, at least nothing that really matters in any deep sense. Now, my intuition about this case is just very clear that the first life is the better life of the two. Now, that doesn't mean that it would be irrational to choose the second life or that it would be wrong to choose the second life. That's a different issue. But I think I have a very clear intuition that the first life is the better life. And I've run variations of this thought experiment by a lot of students and colleagues. And from what I can tell, that's the typical reaction. It's common for people to have the intuition that the first life is the better of the two. But I don't know, what do you guys think about that case?
Well, John had an analogy when he was in his debates responding to Cosmic Skeptic, but I would just quickly say that I think that's everyone's intuition, because we look at the kid who grows up and gets his own place, gets a job where it challenges him, is far better than the kid who just lives in his mom's basement until he's like 60. I mean, clearly, we'd say it's clearly intrinsically good to move out and have a challenging life versus just hiding in the comfort of your parents.
Mm-hmm. And there are some other claims that Alex made in the debate that were about like what is merely instrumentally valuable as opposed to what is non-instrumentally valuable that I think can be challenged with thought experiments. So I'll just give one more example. I don't want to dominate the conversation here, but let me squeeze in one more example maybe. So there was one point in the debate where Michael, you were appealing to the value of interpersonal relationships and claiming that these are really valuable sorts of things. And I think your claim was that they're in fact non-instrumentally valuable sorts of things. And Alex's response, if I understood correctly, was to argue roughly that, well, it's not necessarily the interpersonal relationships themselves that are valuable, but it's rather like the enjoyable experiences that they tend to produce. And so the relationships are only like instrumentally valuable because they're useful for generating those kinds of experiences, which are non-instrumentally valuable. So actually, there is a thought experiment, a really famous thought experiment that has convinced a lot of philosophers that that kind of view is false. It hasn't convinced everybody. This is, of course, still controversial. But here's the thought experiment. It's Robert Nozick's experience machine. So Nozick says, like, all right, suppose that neuroscientists invent this machine where you can kind of like get inside this machine and have all these wires plugged into your brain, and you can program it to simulate for you pretty much whatever life experiences you want. And moreover, you will actually forget that you're inside this machine, so that once you get in the machine and you start having whatever experiences you programmed it to give you, you believe that they're really happening. So the machine might make you think that you're actually in these like relationships with friends and family, and you'll have all like the pleasures that come with that, right? It will seem that way to you, and you'll enjoy the experiences that you have with them. But as a matter of fact, none of those experiences correspond to reality, because unbeknownst to you, you're actually just plugged into this machine. You're like a brain in a vat. The common intuitive response to this, and even someone like Ben Bradley, who resists this case and defends a version of hedonism, admits that this is the intuitive response. The common intuitive response is to think like, that's not a very good life. And that given the choice, most people, it seems like, probably would not choose to get in the experience machine. In fact, I was thinking about this recently, and I don't know, it's very hard for me to imagine what my life situation would have to be like for me to think that I would be better off getting in the experience machine. I think it would actually be an extreme tragedy to live the experience machine life, even if I didn't realize it while I was in the machine.
So people are really wanting to hear what do you mean, John? What do you have to say?
Okay, yeah. So when it comes to this, like, and here's again some of my kind of initial thoughts. And sorry, it seems like my baby might be crying in the back. He does every time I go on for some reason. But anyways, yeah. So my kind of thing is that it seemed to me when in that clip, Cosmic was speaking from his from like, one perspective of the situation, as if it's all about what we want, right? And what we want is not always best. We know that, right? And that seems like the perspective that he thought had the most weight, and it doesn't really take into account like the bigger picture, right? It's kind of like in the beginning when of his opening, when he talked about his friend that got killed, he used the same sort of analogy, and he treated it as if there's both things can't be true. Like he's saying, well, I can't be sad at my friend's death, because we should be happy because God's using it for greater good. That's not what we're saying. Like both things can be true. You can be personally sad at the situation. You can be sad, but that doesn't mean that there is no bigger picture. You see what I mean? As if there's not other perspectives or a bigger picture that you can punt this into. And I think that that's kind of the thing that it seems to permeate a lot of his views, is because they go off of these kind of intuitions that start from a place of an individualistic perspective. And then we say, okay, from this perspective, what do we want? We think life is all about being happy, so therefore God should want us all to be happy. But that's just an assumption I don't think is warranted, especially when we're finite and there's an omniscient being, And so I don't want to appeal to mystery or something like that and just say that mystery is the answer. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, though, is that I'm appealing to what we do know, and what we do know is that we're finite humans, and there are different perspectives other than our own. And with God's omniscience, it doesn't mean that our perspective is the dominant view that should be held and should be the standard that we hold God accountable to.
So I want to say something about the experience machine. I think I completely agree with you, Justin, it's much better to have actual experiences and have actual friends and have actual relationships than just to have experiences. So I think I would line up on that side personally, and take that for what it's worth. I think that I agree. I think that's it makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, Michael.
I was going to say, building on John, I think it was Kirk McGregor wrote a paper on gratuitous evil, and he basically argued that gratuitous evil does exist, and Christians should not defend the idea that every evil has to be used for some sort of purpose for God. And he made some pretty good points in it. But I think one of the basic ideas is that we're not saying that every evil has to be instrumentally good. We're saying that the basic, in a nutshell, is that God has created a world where there is randomness and freedom, and with that there's going to be some instances that God did not determine or want, but ultimately God can still build souls through this, building on certain evils within those worlds, and make such good creatures that any sort of intrinsic goodness from that can overcome any suffering, gratuitous or not. So I don't think Christians have to jump on this bandwagon and say that, well, there's no gratuitous suffering. I mean, Kirk McGregor's paper on it is pretty good and explains why.
Yeah, that's actually a really good segue into the next clip. But I want to talk about one last thing before we do that, and that's the bit about, he's saying, Alex was saying that we shouldn't thank the person throwing the grenade because it helped bring about bravery. And I think that when I heard that, my initial reaction was like, yeah, we probably don't want to thank that person, but it kind of seems like we should if we think that this is a very valuable thing that he helped to bring into the world. And so my initial, or not initial, but my thought now is that I think in the long run, I think that that's just to bite the bullet that, yeah, we should ultimately in the long run, if we meet this person later on in heaven and we're both able to reflect on how our lives contributed to the greater good and how God set up the world and everything, I think that we kind of should be thankful for the things that happened and the things that shaped our character, even if those things were intrinsically bad. I don't know. I think that that's kind of the better view to take, even though it might seem a little like weird at first. Anyways, what are y'all thoughts?
Also too, just to reiterate kind of what I said earlier, that you can still be thankful for the bigger picture and not be happy about the circumstances, you know what I mean, that brought about the bigger picture. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. Both things can still be true, and your emotions aren't invalid.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you can recognize this is a bad thing that you did, but I'm still thankful for the bigger picture.
That's right.
Justin, looks like you want to say something.
About that case. I agree with John's point for sure. I think, yeah, maybe what we need to do is distinguish between being thankful to God for what has happened and being thankful to, like, the human agent who threw the bomb. You might think it's appropriate to thank God for the evil, or at least what it caused, but for different reasons, not appropriate to thank the human agent who was clearly operating in a different way than God was and for different reasons. And one way to actually make sense of this, so I actually thought that I think there's a good way to reconcile some of the intuitions that Michael was pushing in the debate and some of the intuitions that Alex was pumping. So on the one hand, you have these intuitions that, like, oh, it seems like, goods like virtue and so on are like these great higher order goods. You would choose a virtuous life over a non-virtuous one, and this kind of thing. On the other hand, you have these cases like Alex raised where it's like, well, but, it seems like you shouldn't, commend the person for throwing the bomb into the, and harming people this way. I think maybe what's going on here is that both intuitions are getting something right, because the good that results from the evil, at least in some cases, maybe not in every one, and maybe not in this individual one, but in some cases, the good maybe does outweigh the evil. But there's a non-consequentialist restriction on causing that evil to bring about that greater good. It might just be impermissible for at least ordinary people in ordinary circumstances to bring about greater goods by means of evils. And if that's what's going on, if that is why Alex and Michael were having the intuitions that they did, then it suggests a way of moving the discussion forward, because it suggests that the place we need to look next is at non-consequentialist restrictions on action. We need to ask, like, okay, are the duties, the non-consequentialist duties, not to, use evil for the sake of greater good in cases like that, do they apply to God in the same way that they apply to us? And that's something that some philosophers are working on. I have published some stuff on that, and I'm still actively researching that subject. But anyway, so that's a direction that I think might be fruitful for the discussion to go if there was like a follow-up debate, maybe.
Man, that would be great. I want to make sure, before I play the next clip, I want to make sure that people got the point that you just made, because I think it's actually really, really powerful. So explain what you mean by non-consequentialism.
Yeah, okay. So consequentialism is just the view that the moral, whether an act is permissible or impermissible is entirely a matter of the value of its consequences. It's about how good the consequences are. And there are a whole bunch of different versions of this view, but that's the core idea. Non-consequentialist constraint is a moral obligation that says you cannot do something that will have good consequences. I mean, this is all I'm putting this in very loose terminology and so forth, but that's roughly the idea.
And to put it back, sorry, just to connect it back to the example that Alex gave, you can't throw a grenade even though it might end up in produce bravery, basically.
Right. Yeah. Even if for some reason that would it would kill like 4 people and save like 100 people, you might think, well, it's still not okay to do that. And if that's right, then that seems to suggest that there is one of these non-consequentialist constraints on action there. There's like a moral duty not to bring about the best consequences for some reason.
And so this is a way of reconciling the two intuitions that are going on here. I think that is just really, really cool to me. By the way, if you're watching this and you're enjoying what Justin is saying about consequentialism, and you haven't even mentioned the term yet, but deontology, I did an interview with him. You can search in the channel, and we talked about a paper that he recently wrote where he says basically we need to have a different, I don't know if this is actually what you say, but roughly a deontological approach to the problem of evil is maybe a better approach, something along those lines. Anyways, all right, any other thoughts before we move on to the next clip? All right, so let me cue this one up. And so what this one is about is actually, let me let you, Justin. I know I'm kind of pushing a lot of this on Justin, but I think that he's the way that he explains things is just great. So give me like the sense of what's about to happen in this clip, the third argument that Alex gives in his opening.
Good. Yeah. So if I understood correctly, Alex's argument in this part of the debate is basically like, look, if you think that theism is true and that God has a good reason for every evil that happens, then it seems like history kind of had to go exactly the way it did. And at the very least, that every particular evil had to happen exactly the way it did because it served some greater purpose that God had. But you might think it's really, really implausible that every evil had to happen exactly the way it did, that there's some good that's served by just, exactly this evil happening in this way at this time to this person and this one to this other person and so on. And if you think that's implausible, then that sounds like a reductio of theism. It seems like, well, we should probably not be theists then. I think that that's roughly Alex's argument in this part.
Okay, so let's play the clip. And by the way, Justin, he texted me earlier and he said that he has 5 different things to say in response to this. So we'll see how many we can get through.
But also, the Christian must contend with the idea that if evil is somehow necessary, whichever account of necessity you give, we must have exactly the right amount of evil in the world. And this is something Michael seems to have implied in his opening statement. This is the most difficult thing for me to accept. If a loving God may need to allow suffering for reasons of free will, higher order goods, or personal development, or whatever it may be, this God would still not allow gratuitous suffering. It wouldn't allow more suffering than is necessary, because then that suffering wouldn't be necessary for good to prevail, and therefore would be unjustified. But it must also be accepted that therefore God couldn't have allowed any less suffering to exist, because this would imply that not all of the evil in the world is in fact necessary, and that therefore God does allow specifically unnecessary suffering, which is incompatible with an omnipotent, loving God. We have to believe in something of a best of all possible worlds approach, that exactly the correct amount of evil exists in the world. Any more, and God would be allowing unnecessary suffering. Any less, and God would be unable to procure whatever goodness is necessitated by that suffering. But this is the implication. When Wilfred Owen describes the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs of his fellow soldier, drowning in a sea of green gas, and when Viktor Frankl describes the popularity of running into electric gates of concentration camps as a suicide method, common enough to be colloquially known simply as running into the wire, the best of all possible worlds approach asks us to accept that had that specific friend of Owen's soldier been spared his fate of choking on poisoned air, and had his death been even remotely less painful, less torturous, less prolonged, that the world would be a worse place for it. Somehow, exactly that amount of suffering is necessitated in order for the general good to obtain, for free will to exist, for heaven to be an option, for higher order goods, for personal development. This must be the maximal state of affairs. 1.31 million Jews were killed during the first 3 months of the Holocaust. Are we expected to believe that this is the perfect number? 1.32 million Jews would have been an unjustifiable evil because this was more than strictly necessary. 1.29 million wouldn't have been quite enough, and the world would be a worse place if those 30,000 extra people were saved. No, allowing 1.32 million Jews exactly to die is the Goldilocks number that is necessitated for good to obtain.
Okay, before we turn to Justin and get some of his thoughts, John, did you want to say something?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to give a quick thought about it, but did you need to finish something first? Or?
No. Go ahead, John.
Okay, yeah, just real quick. See, this is the problem, I think, with a lot of these type arguments is they're based on somebody's particular intuition, right? Like, what reason do we have to believe that, there isn't a perfect number of suffering or perfect balance of suffering? Just because it might seem counterintuitive to him that, this amount of people needed to die and not this amount of people needed to die. That's based purely on intuition. We don't have any reason to believe that that's true. Just because it's kind of like the alien argument to me, which I just don't buy, and I don't understand why people buy it. But they say because the universe is so big, therefore there must be life on other planets. And I just don't see how that follows just because it's bigger, right? I think that's all contingent upon how life originated on this earth. Then you can assess the probability. But but similar to that is just why I don't like those kind of arguments, because it might sound intuitive, but we don't have any reason to think it's true. So we need to make a distinction between, the kind of, I want to say, the rhetorical intuition and what reasons we have to believe that that's true, that balance isn't perfectly balanced, So I just don't see a reason to believe that his fundamental assumption necessary for the entire argument to go through is it can be backed or supported with any evidence.
In building on that, I don't even know if we have to say that God is obligated to create the best possible world. This is what Mooney was just talking about earlier. I mean, and Trent Doherty brings it up in his book as well, is that there may not be a best possible world. How would you really sort of measure the idea of like less or even more evil with the give and take in that kind of sense? Why do we have to believe that there is there is a best of all possible worlds that God has to achieve? I mean, what is his ultimate goal? If his ultimate goal is reducing suffering and increasing pleasure, that you could make the case that this is not the best possible world. But if God is trying to create virtuous creatures, then based on what the definition of good is, this could be the best possible world in achieving that, or at least one of the best possible worlds in achieving that.
Yeah, so my initial thought when I heard this was to think about something that I've either read or heard someone else articulate. Actually, I think it was from Peter S. Williams in a podcast of his. His podcast is really good, by the way, if you want to search for it. Peter S. Williams. He's a Christian apologist. He actually teamed up with William Lane Craig a few years back and debated Arif Ahmed and some other guy. Anyways, it was a really good debate. Really, really enjoyed that one. But Peter S. Williams is really cool, and he summarized the work of a Christian philosopher by the name of Peter Van Inwagen. And Peter Van Inwagen has an argument that he calls, I think it's called the no minimum thesis. Is that the right term for it, Justin?
I don't remember actually what name he gives it, but the name is...
Well, yeah, the name isn't super important, but let me give an analogy that might help flesh out the idea. So the analogy is, oh good, we have actually two guys with beards. So look at Inspiring Philosophy's beard right now, okay? If we took away one hair off of his chin, would that mean that he no longer has a beard? The answer is obviously no. So there's a sort of range of hairs that are going to, I guess, make it the case that he has a beard. And so there's no minimum amount necessarily of hairs, but there is, like, we can just kind of look at him and recognize, yes, he has a beard, or no, he's like too patchy or whatever else. Like, no, he doesn't have a beard, or maybe it's too short, or maybe he doesn't have enough hair on his face.
Couldn't you?
I couldn't help it. No, but the beard analogy is supposed to show that maybe it's not the case that every hair is necessary for a beard. And so likewise, maybe every case of suffering is not necessary to bring about some greater good. And this is actually his argument that gratuitous suffering is compatible with God's existence, because there is no minimum amount of suffering that's required in order to bring about these greater goods. God could have used one less case of suffering or one more case of suffering. And so it does kind of seem like there's a range, instead of like every particular case has to have some kind of particular justification. Just like we don't necessarily have to have a reason for every hair that's on his face to be there in order to constitute him having a beard.
Yeah, and to just quickly piggyback off of that, I always kind of was confused too. I don't understand why we have the assumption that every single bad thing that happens needs to be explained in some way too. Because if you kind of think about it, it could be that, for example, if the greatest moral virtue is love, right? And in order to have love, you have to have free will. If that's the highest virtue, and if God is love, and everything kind of stems from that, then that's the higher virtue, right? And then so when it comes to the suffering and stuff like that, that could just be an underlying deficiency that would have to be, suppressed underneath there. So like it could be the case that just bad things happen, and that's a consequence of free will, you know what I mean, that sort of thing too. But I know that doesn't really fully account for like natural evil, that sort of thing too. But there's other things that would account for that, just like the what we do with pollution and that sort of thing, and how it affects like tsunamis and earthquakes and all these other type things too. So but that's just one thing too, like bad stuff could just happen. And so I've always kind of been curious about that, why people assume that like there has to be an explanation for every single bad thing that happens, even though I think it's possible that there could be, God's omniscience. But anyways, quick thoughts.
I was gonna say, oh gosh, now we have everyone in the comments making beard puns.
Awesome.
I mean, the beard steals the conversation. What do you want? Oh, and this is the first beard in my family, on my mom's and my dad's sides, for like 3 generations. Somehow I managed to grow one. Like my dad can't, like my grandpa couldn't. Like it was just.
Yeah, I definitely can't.
The laws of biology.
Because I was going to say, if Cameron, if you lost one piece of hair on your beard, then your beard will go away, right?
I don't have a beard. I've never had a beard.
That's the point. That's the point. Lose one hair, it's gone. Debunked.
All right. Well, Justin, give me your 5 responses to this argument.
All right, I'll try to fire these off really quickly because I've been talking too much. And actually, you guys have already hit on some of them, so that'll make it quicker.
Okay.
So I think that Alex's objection is a very serious concern for the view that there's a best possible world, or actually more carefully for the view that this is the best possible world. And maybe that's all he meant. Maybe I misunderstood that. But if it's meant to be an objection to theism, here are 5 objections that I have to that objection, I guess. So one is, it might be the case that there's like an exact amount of evil that is needed for some good purpose that God has, but no like exact distribution of evil. So if we take as an example the soul-making theodicy, just for the sake of example, like Trent Doherty in his book talks about God designing a world that's going to have like the right kind of amount and frequency of suffering, but God doesn't necessarily need any specific like distribution of suffering, like, oh, this person over here suffers in this way at this time. No, you just need the right kind of environment so it's like optimal for promoting soul making. So that would be one way of responding to this objection. A second objection to the objection would be you might actually think, look, there doesn't need to even be a specific amount of evil. You just need the right balance of good to evil. So that if God allows more evil, then it has to be the case that God gets more good out of that. Like, say, maybe there would be more soul making. And, if God allows less evil, it would have to be, maybe that comes with like less soul making. But it might be that there's a lot of places on this spectrum that are permissible because you get the right balance of good and evil. Okay, third objection. This one is the Van Inwagen objection that Cameron already introduced, which is basically to say, like, look, there's a lot of vagueness in the world. You might think that there just is no definite line of like, okay, exactly this many evils or whatever are needed for God to achieve God's goals. Just like you might think, and this is one of Van Inwagen's examples, that maybe there just is no exact number of days in prison that's like the morally right punishment for any given crime. So you might think, okay, look, there just isn't any. And so any amount of evil that God picks is going to be more, in some sense, more than what was necessary because there's no minimum line. Okay, fourth objection. You might think that this actually, Michael already raised this point, so I'll again try to be quick here. You might think that there just is no best possible world because for any world you pick, there's always a better. Worlds increase in value infinitely. There's no top best world. This is a view that's actually really, really common now among theist philosophers. And a lot of the theist philosophers who take this position argue that in that situation, the thing that God would do is just arbitrarily pick a very good world. I mean, not completely arbitrarily, but somewhat arbitrarily. And if you think, following people like Plantinga and Leibniz and whoever, that like all the best worlds have evil in them, then it might be the case that when God sort of somewhat arbitrarily picks a good enough world, it's going to be one of the worlds with evil in it. Okay, and then the fifth objection is this whole idea of like trying to optimize like good versus evil is not actually how ordinary morality seems to work. So, for example, it seems permissible to me that I could have kids if I wanted to. But if I did that, I would end up having to spend like lots of my money and other resources on those kids. Whereas if I didn't, one thing I could do instead is give a lot more money to charities that are like helping out with natural disaster relief or any other kind of like aid like that. And you might think that that second approach would actually result in less overall suffering in the world. But weirdly, just if we go on the way like ordinary people think that morality works, it seems like morality doesn't actually require us to act in that way. Morality doesn't demand of us that we, choose our path through life in such a way that we optimize the balance between suffering and good or just minimize suffering. And if it doesn't work that way for us, it's just not obvious that it would work that way for God. And so that's just, I guess, maybe a lacuna in the argument that would have to be addressed. Okay, so those were my 5 objections, and I don't know if you wanted to talk about any of those in more detail or just move on.
No, I think we should probably move on to the last clip that we have queued up here, which is animal suffering, unless anyone would like to say anything else. Good to go for the next one? Okay, so the next one is about animal suffering, and it came in his second rebuttal, Alex's second rebuttal, which was, I think, 5 minutes, and he spent about 2 minutes talking about animal suffering. So here's the clip, and then we'll talk about it.
But also, the Christian must contend with the idea that if evil is somehow necessary, whichever account of necessity you give, we must have exactly the right amount of evil in the world. And this is something Michael seems to have implied in his opening statement. This is the most difficult thing for me to accept. If a loving God may need to allow suffering for reasons of free will, higher order goods, or personal development, or whatever it may be, this God would still not allow gratuitous suffering. It wouldn't allow more suffering than is necessary, because then that suffering wouldn't be necessary for good to prevail, and therefore would be unjustified. But it must also be accepted that therefore God couldn't have allowed any less suffering to exist, because this would imply that not all of the evil in the world is in fact necessary, and that therefore God does allow specifically unnecessary suffering, which is incompatible with an omnipotent, loving God. We have to believe in something of a best of all possible worlds approach, that exactly the correct amount of evil exists in the world. Any more, and God would be allowing unnecessary suffering.
Okay, so I think I have actually the wrong clip pulled up here.
Yeah,
so let me. Yeah, it was the same one. So let me. Sorry, I have to do this live, so it's gonna be a little wonky at first, but I'm actually gonna pull up the clip one more time and do some things in the back end. So it's just gonna have to look weird.
But also, the Christian must. I'd also like to respond to the point you make about soul building, especially because earlier you applied it to animals, or at least quoted someone who did. You said, in your words, it was something like, God allows this to happen because he knows you'll get through it and you'll be better for it. I'd like to know, as pertains to animals, when a pig is put into a gas chamber, how the pig is better off for it, especially if a pig doesn't have the kind of same capacities for ensoulment as we do, and isn't going to kind of achieve the same heavenly existence as we do, unless you believe in some kind of pig heaven or something like that. I'm not sure. It sounds like a fatuous point, but that's only because of how fatuously people treat animal ethics, rather than it actually being a silly idea to have something like pig heaven. But also, of course, that's moral evil. But if a deer gets its leg caught under a falling tree and starves to death in the forest in agony and confusion, who's that benefiting? It's not benefiting any human soul. It's not benefiting any God, as far as I can see, and it's certainly not benefiting the deer. I really don't see what explanation there can possibly be to this. And bear in mind, the people listening, I mean, that every argument that seems to be put forward about free will and loving God, and about higher order goods, and about personal development and responsibility, none of these seem to apply to animals. None of them. Which leads people like Descartes to say that animals can't feel pain. Which leads people like C.S. Lewis to entertain the idea that animals can't feel pain, or at the very least feel it in a different way to we do, because there's just no other way to explain the fact that these animals experience so much suffering. Because as C.S. Lewis notes in The Problem of Pain, in his chapter on animal suffering, it's like, I don't know what else we can do here. The traditional responses don't seem to hold. We've got to come up with something better, or we just have to entertain the idea that maybe animals don't feel suffering, or their suffering is somehow different qualitatively to ours. The issue of animal suffering is probably more troubling and more important an argument than the issue of human suffering, although of course human suffering is a derivative of animal suffering, and yet it never gets a mention. It doesn't get a mention in the video that you made, Michael, except I think there was one like passing mention to it, but not even kind of directly addressing it, just used as an example. In any debate that I've watched, in any essay I read or book I read, except for maybe something like The Problem of Pain, it doesn't get a mention. And why should it? Because it poses the hardest problem. Because any argument you can put forward to how people are benefited by pain, there's just no way that I can see, and no argument that I've heard, I should say, more importantly, that says that those justifications can apply to that deer in that forest that no one ever knows even existed.
All right, so sorry about the little technical difficulty that we had there, but we're good to go, and the clip played. So where should we begin on this one? IP, how did you respond? Because you didn't really get to respond to that. That was kind of the thing there, is that right after that clip played, we went to Q&A, and we didn't have any kind of like structured back and forth or like cross-examination or anything. So I think that you discussed it a little bit, maybe in a question that came up.
Yeah, I noted that there are people that have dealt with this, like Josh Rasmussen and Trent Doherty wrote a whole book on the problem of animal pain. The basic, the nutshell argument is that animals are also souls being built. However, they're currently, due to physical limitations, sort of like in a state like you would have like an infant, like a human infant, or someone who's born with some sort of mental problems, that they're like in a vegetative state. They can't continue to mature and soul build in this physical environment. However, upon death, they're sort of released from that, and they're able to continue their soul building. So God is, in a sense, still building their souls, like He's building ours. It's just that theirs are not as efficient because of their physical restraints. And so that's just the basic argument. And then you could also build, well, why doesn't God just create every creature a certain way that they can start building their soul right away? You could see Josh Rasmussen's paper on problem of evolutionary suffering with regards to that. But I mean, like, that was the basic idea I would give to that sort of argument.
Yeah, so there has been work in the literature. There is current literature right now out there that's been available for at least, I don't know when Trent Doherty's book was written. It was written at least a few years ago, so it's been out there a while. So Alex has had a chance to find out that this book exists and that there are defenses of it, or arguments, extending different theodicies, like the soul-building theodicy, to animals. So that's just a fact, and it's unfortunate that he hasn't gotten to that point yet.
Real quick, just to add to that, in the Bible, animals and humans are ontologically the same. I mean, Ecclesiastes chapter 3 basically says that animals are said to have a nephesh, the breath of life, a spirit, or there's never any sort of ontological distinction ever made between humans and animals. The only difference is humans were given this sort of election point called the Imago Dei.
Oh, yeah. I was also going to mention, I didn't say this at the very beginning of the stream, but there were several points during the debate where I really wanted to say something. And because the format, it was like formal, I couldn't just like step in and ask for clarification or respond to something that Alex said or even respond to something that you said. So that was kind of difficult. But yeah, on the point about animals and how they could undergo something like theosis, I think that is very, very plausible. And if you just think about the fact that on Christian theology, humans are not going in their resurrected state, their glorified state, the kind of state that is described as Jesus' body in the Gospels. Jesus' body sort of operates according to a different set of laws of nature, if you want to put it in those terms. And so what I think is that the same type of transformation can happen. If it can happen for humans, there's not a really good reason to think that it can't happen for non-human animals. And here's another way of thinking about it. It's very, very plausible that humans are not if something like a multiverse exists, humans are not the only kind of embodied conscious creatures that exist. And even I was listening back to a discussion that I hosted with Robin Collins and Josh Rasmussen on the fine-tuning argument, and Robin Collins was saying that he finds it really plausible that there's like a multiverse that exists, that God has created several different types of embodied conscious beings, and possibly even sent Jesus there to to overcome the sins of their world or whatever else. So there's all of these different possibilities. And if you think like it's just a very kind of narrow view of the possibility space. Basically, it's a very uncreative view. So I think that we should be open to that kind of thing, like animals gaining rational faculties at the eschaton. I think that that's actually really cool. Justin, what do you? Who do I want to go to? Because I want to ask John. Because John, you don't really take the problem of animal suffering very seriously. So I'm kind of curious to throw it over to you.
Well, that's not true. I just always am questioning the assumptions that it's built off of, right? So, like, what makes humans distinct from animals? And I'd say, yeah, it's like the Imago Dei, and people, theologians have, try to dissect what exactly the Imago Dei means. Is it these cognitive, or are these functions or whatever for rationality or whatever? And so I guess like it kind of just depends on that, right? Like I do think that you can see in animals, they're not entirely reducible down to the physical mechanisms the same way humans are. But I just don't know enough, I guess I'd say, about like how exactly we're like them. What makes us different is what's the fundamental thing. And then after that, we can discuss, because I think that like when we are saved, we do change our ontological status, you know what I mean, with God, in other words, because we become adopted into his family and that sort of thing. And then the sacrifice had to be for humans as well. That's why Jesus had to come as God and man, right? And so like I don't know how that. I'm just trying to think through. I was thinking through when I was listening to you how that kind of functions in my mind, or functions theologically, to say that these during the times of the eschatological time period or whatever, these animals get these new things. It wouldn't be related to Jesus' sacrifice, for our new body. So I'm just kind of curious what that's like. There's just a lot of kind of questions that make it kind of confusing, I think, for when we try to assume something like that. But I haven't read Trent Doherty and Josh Rasmussen's stuff on it too, so I could change my mind, or I'm open to be convinced one way or another.
Justin, I know you have a lot to say about this one, so what you got?
Yeah. So I think Alex is right that this subject is less discussed than like human suffering in the literature on the problem of evil. And so it's not, terribly surprising that he hasn't stumbled on a lot of work trying to address this problem. But there is definitely, as you guys have been pointing out, there is work on this. So there is Trent's book from 2014. There was also, I think, a really helpful book published in 2008 by Mike Murray called Nature Red in Tooth and Claw. And in that book, he surveys, I think, about 6 different possible like theistic accounts of animal suffering, and he endorses some of them and not others. But it's a really helpful kind of like overview of like, all right, what are some of the options here? So I recommend that book. And I think in fairness, we should also say, people like Richard Swinburne, Peter Van Inwagen, William Hasker, all talk about animal suffering in their major works on the problem of evil. So, it does get discussed. I think just to make sure that we've clearly presented Doherty's view, as I understand it, the idea is that once an animal is resurrected and then raised to like personhood, is one way some people put it, is that the animal then has the opportunity to like look back on its life, to be reminded or told about what happened to it, and then respond to the suffering that it experienced in its life. And Doherty's thought is like, look, it can either respond in a virtuous way or a vicious way. It can decide to be bitter about that suffering, or it can decide to embrace its role in God's plan for the universe. And if it does decide to embrace its role, then this amounts to a kind of soul making for that creature and ultimately defeats the evil, Doherty says. Mm-hmm. So that's one way of dealing with the problem of animal suffering, where you have this kind of like after the fact soul making in an animal afterlife. And then there
which is not too disanalogous between like what happens to infants that die, at a very young age, is that they didn't have a chance to really develop their cognitive faculties to the point of being able to reflect on the suffering that they experienced and everything. And so we still think that some type of soul building is going to occur for them. So it's not too disanalogous between what sort of already happens with humans in some cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And then maybe just to give one more example, there are lots of people who appeal to values like gnomic regularity in the natural world, or like the progress and development and evolution, or like the narrative structure of like a world evolving, to try to explain, why God would permit animal suffering. And that was, I think, the point of the rainforest analogy that was that Michael used in the debate. That was something Michael and I had talked about before the debate. And I wanted to say something about that because Alex, didn't find that case convincing at all, which is totally fine, and maybe some people won't. But I find it actually my intuition about this is really strong. So it seems to me that even if we assume that the rainforest is like this isolated ecosystem, so that it wouldn't harm anything outside of the rainforest if we just destroyed the whole thing, I think it would be just an enormous tragedy to tear down the rainforest. And one way to maybe try to pump this intuition for people is even if you just imagine a single, very old, very large tree that's been standing for 100 years, right? It's a tragedy to cut down a tree like that if it's still living at any rate. And similarly, take a single individual species, right? People care when an individual species goes extinct. And the kinds of things that they cite when you ask, well, why? What's the big deal? They'll talk about, it contributes to diversity of life on Earth. It's unique. In the case of the tree, you might talk about its natural beauty or something like that. And it seems to me tearing down the rainforest would be doing things like that on a massive scale. And so the amount of value that you'd just be destroying would be massive. And it seems to me it's surprising. I used to think, as some people, including Trent Doherty, do, that there's just no hope of aesthetic value and gnomic regularity and stuff like that justifying animal suffering. But when I thought about this rainforest case, I was well, wait a minute. The rainforest pretty much runs on animal suffering. But in my intuition, at any rate, is no, it would not be a good thing to destroy the rainforest. And the reasons seem to be things beauty and diversity and whatever else.
Could we say that it's just the mere existence of life in the rainforest is just more intrinsically good than any suffering that would happen there?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I honestly, this is a relatively recent thought that I had when I was teaching on the problem of evil this past semester. I want to think a lot more about okay, what are the relevant values here that are...
I thought when you gave me the analogy, it was a very good analogy, because we're called to stop evil and suffering in cases where there's horrible things this is why we stopped the Nazis. It was horrible. But in the rainforest, there is immense suffering for the animals and the species there. And think of all the coming generations in 1,000 years that are going to be living in the rainforest. If we could, shouldn't we just chop it all down, stop the suffering, grow a bunch of trees or agriculture there to feed a growing population that because humans would experience less suffering there than possibly a lot of the creatures there.
Yeah, I think with a lot of these questions, it's kind of the same thing as a battle of intuitions a lot. But really, I think you want to be choosing between greater and lesser evils, right? Because optimally, you'd want, I guess you would say, people's intuition will go this way, at least, for there to be no suffering and no, the rainforest stays, the animal stays, humans stay, everything like that. But if you kind of rank things in terms of the lesser evils, it's just like any other of those kind of moral dilemmas that you're presented with, the trolley and all those too. So I think kind of people are going to land differently based on what their intuitions say to kind of stack these things. So it's kind of a side note.
Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot else to add on this point. Is there anything else that you guys would like to discuss from the debate that we haven't covered yet? Michael, you got anything to?
No, I was very happy with the outcome of the debate. I got a lot of good feedback from. After the debate, I got 15 messages or so, people saying they loved it and they loved the argument. So I appreciate a lot of the Justin Mooney helping me out with a lot of that as well. So I appreciate.
Let me ask you a question. What was the most challenging thing that he brought up that you think was most difficult thing to address?
I think the Goldilocks thing, of course, is the challenge, because why is there this right amount of suffering? Why is God allowing this much or that much? And I was trying, and I think we fleshed it out here more. But one of the things I was trying to get at is that we don't have to have a best possible world. That's not God's aim or God's obligations. God is trying to create virtuous creatures. He's not going to say, well, I'm going to pick the world where there's the least amount of suffering, because God can look at all the possible worlds and go, well, I can use any one of these to bring about the virtuous creatures that I want. So I think, building on Josh Rasmussen's paper, it's that God is an omnipotent, omniscient being, so he could just determine everything how he wants. Or, for a more interesting, unique, intrinsically good world, he could create a world with randomness and free creatures and just let the souls build within that environment. And so you're going to get suffering, you're going to get evil, you're going to get these randomness in there, but God is not causing everything, so he's creating real free creatures that have to deal with randomness. That's a far more interesting reality, because think of the unique stories that could come out of that. But then God also could say with that universe that regardless of the evil or suffering that's going to come out, I can imbue this idea of a law of triumph, that no matter what evil happens, it can always be overcome or outdone by the good in the universe. And so there's no need to really worry about what suffering could happen, or if there could be less suffering and still create virtuous creatures. Because if God imbued something like a law of triumph, then God can always overcome the evil regardless of what it was and turn it into good in a sense.
Here's one thing, I was thinking more about the problem of animal pain, and here's one thing that Doherty's view has going for it, that when I was studying his, when I read his book, and I was looking over the arguments and thinking more deeply about it, it really made me reconsider the way that I treat animals and the way that I think about animals. And like, if, hey, I might see this dog again in the future and like might have a conversation with him. Like it's kind of funny to think about, but you know, if you follow the logic of the argument and how it all works and everything, it made me have a greater appreciation for animals and like want to treat them better. So I think that's kind of a, you know, it's not the goal of the argument. The argument is to see if it works and if it's plausible and reasonable and all of that stuff, but it has an interesting consequence. I even talked to Trent about this, and he said that the same thing happened to him. I thought that was pretty interesting. All right, well, unless you guys have any additional thoughts, I think that's going to do it for this review. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to come out and talk. And yeah, if you want to learn more about What Do You Meme, check the link in the description. Same for Inspiring Philosophy. If you want to check out my discussion with Justin on the problem of evil, his deontological approach to it, then you can also check out the link in the description. I've got links to all of those. So appreciate you guys coming on. We'll see y'all later.
Cool. Thanks, man.